There are those few among us who would try to pull us backwards. They underestimated us, our resilience, our resolve, our desire to look up at the heavens and never look back.
When we last looked at the For All Mankind alternate timeline, the year was 1992 and the events of Season 3 were about to get underway. Bill Clinton had become the Democratic frontrunner after defeating Gary Hart's Vice President Al Gore, pitting him against the Republican Ellen Wilson. In the late 80s, a global space boom kicked off, which paved the way for private sector investment in space. Karen Baldwin and Sam Cleveland started the world's first space tourism company, Polaris Space Tours, and by 1992, at the beginning of Season 3, they launched the Polaris Orbital Hotel. To kick off its soft opening, the Polaris hosted the wedding of astronaut Danny Stevens, with Ed Baldwin and Danielle Poole among the guests. In that same month, the North Korean space program had launched a rocket that exploded in orbit. A portion of the debris drifted in that direction and hit the space hotel, creating a disaster. This led to the closing of the Polaris company, which sold the station to the aerospace division of Helios. They rose to prominence in developing fusion technology that helped mitigate the effects of global warming. Led by Deb Iessa, they converted the hotel into a spacecraft called Phoenix in an attempt to enter the race to Mars. This is something that had been developing in the alternate timeline, with the US announcing a manned mission in 1996. In our timeline, this is something we still haven't done, but exploration of Mars has been a goal for both the US and Soviet space programs from the beginning. The first successful flyby happened way back in 1965, with the first lander reaching the surface in 1971. The first rover started operating in 1997, and in the 21st century, several countries have launched successful missions to study the planet. China and NASA both have rovers on the Red Planet currently, and NASA even has the Ingenuity helicopter that's completed 19 flights accompanying their Perseverance rover. While Perseverance's larger mission to try to return some of the samples it's collecting back to Earth is impressive, we're still a long way from sending people there. Mostly this is because it's expensive and complicated, and there isn't active competition to get there first in our timeline like there is in For All Mankind. In an effort to upstage NASA's plans of sending a mission led by Danielle Poole to Mars in 1996 in the alternate timeline, Helios announced that they'd be launching their mission in 1994, securing Ed Baldwin to be the commander. This caused NASA and the Soviets to push their missions up by 2 years to compete, and led to a time jump in the show. But to close out 1992, Ellen Wilson defeated Bill Clinton to become the first woman elected president of the United States. The year 1993 passes off-screen as the major parties prepare their missions to Mars. Although part of NASA's program involves launching a support mission ahead of time containing supplies to arrive before Sojourner, and they did do that in 1993. Unbeknownst to anyone, North Korea launched a secret mission to Mars in September of 1994. The following month, Helios Aerospace launched its private mission to Mars, NASA launched Sojourner 1, and Roscosmos launched Mars 94. The name of the Soviet mission is based on the ambitious real-world Mars program that was approved in 1989 of our timeline. Of course, economic chaos followed the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, which led to Mars 94 being deferred initially and renamed Mars 96 before being shelved indefinitely. After launch, the show's version of Mars 94 tried to make a push to stay in the race, causing its engines to fail. The Helios program was best equipped to mount a rescue mission, but the higher-ups at their Mission Command Center refused to help. The crew on board tried to mount the rescue anyway, but found that they were unable to control the ship after being locked out by a software update sent from Earth. This meant that Sojourner 1 had to abandon their mission and come to the rescue. This led to a disaster that killed 2 astronauts and a cosmonaut, but NASA was able to figure out a way to refuel Sojourner from the disabled Soviet ship and continue to Mars with the remaining crew members. In February 1995, the North Korean mission that was still unknown outside the country crash-landed on the surface of the Red Planet, making the sole survivor of the 2-man capsule, Lee Jung-gil, the first human on Mars. Later in that same month, dust storms caused Ed Baldwin to abort Helios' attempt to land, while Sojourner 1's attempt was successful. The Soviet cosmonaut Grigory Kuznetsov attempted to make it to the surface first, which led to him and Daniel Poole being recognized as the first humans to sort of co-step on Mars until the North Korean mission was revealed. After the weather clears up, Helios lands to establish their Martian base, while NASA establishes Happy Valley Base with their crew and the remaining cosmonauts from Mars 94. Drama develops over a couple of different events that take place early in the respective missions. Astronaut Will Tyler was so inspired by the experience that he decided to come out as gay in an interview. This became big news and caused President Wilson, who herself was a closeted homosexual, to sign an executive order excluding LGBT people from the military, while also making it illegal to question a service member's sexual orientation. This is the alternate timelines version of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was instituted during Bill Clinton's presidency in 1993. This was the official U.S. policy until it was repealed in 2011. In the show's version of events, a scandal involving the first gentleman, President Wilson's husband, who was also a closeted homosexual, threatened her administration. In a national news conference, as he was getting ready to accept responsibility, Ellen took his place at the podium and announced that she was gay instead. This led to strong reactions across the political spectrum, and we'll come back to that when we get to the end of her term. Larry's scandal had echoes of President Clinton's scandal with Monica Lewinsky, since both involved sexual relations in the Oval Office. In our timeline, Clinton's sexual relationship with Lewinsky ended in 1997 and led to his impeachment in the House in 1998 before he was acquitted by the Senate. The other big event on Mars was that even though NASA saved their cosmonauts and made it possible for them to get there, the Soviets took their discovery of a large deposit of liquid water to Helios. They start a joint drilling project that ends in disaster, in large part because Danny Stevens failed to do his job. The mission is a complete failure. Gagarin Ridge collapses, and astronauts Isabel Castillo, Nick Corrado, and one cosmonaut, Alexei Polotov, are killed. Polotov was involved in an intimate relationship with astronaut Kelly Baldwin, who became the first pregnant woman on Mars as a result. In the aftermath of the disaster, the remaining crews worked together to excavate Helios' Mars Surface Access Module, which was buried by the landslide. In an attempt to make the MSAM functional, Danielle and Grigory traveled to salvage a part from the North Korean crash site. Much to their surprise, they learned that not only was the North Korean mission manned, but also that cosmonaut Lee Jung-gil survived. Because of the language barrier, they can't explain why they're there, and eventually have to forcibly detain him and escort him to Happy Valley. Discovering his capsule solved one problem, but by the time they returned, a new one arose as Kelly's condition deteriorated to the point that the doctor felt there was a 24-hour window to get her to the Phoenix and deliver the baby, or they could both die. At this point in their preparations, it wouldn't be possible to get everyone off of the surface, and will require a heroic effort from Ed and Kelly Baldwin to get her to safety. On the ground at JSC, the engineers realize that even if they leave all the other astronauts behind, they still only have 95% of the fuel necessary to get Kelly to Pathfinder. They devise a solution that requires the pregnant astronaut to launch herself from the top of the MSAM, and for Ed to manage a controlled crash as he returns to the surface. Miraculously, they both survive, but another tragedy takes place when a radical terrorist group detonates a truck bomb outside of Johnson Space Center. This plot was put into motion by a disgruntled moon marine, Charles Burnitz, who served at Jamestown Base during the Soviet attack in 1983. He was patrolling the mining site 357 Bravo when the incident took place and never accepted the official story. There was a kernel of truth to this. The official investigation suppressed information about a secret second nuclear reactor that was used to manufacture weapons-grade plutonium. But ultimately, Burnitz and his co-conspirators were inspired by conspiracy theories. In their preparations, they recruited Jimmy Stevens, who had become disillusioned with NASA after the deaths of his parents, Gordon and Tracy Stevens. He made use of his connections at JSC to help the group without knowing the full implications of what they were planning. On the day of the mission to return Kelly to Pathfinder, the conspirators attempted to pose as journalists and broadcast NASA's corruption to the world. Because of her connection to Jimmy, Karen Baldwin figured out something was going on, and when she attempted to alert security, Burnett's used a remote device to detonate the bomb. This destroyed most of the main office building, killing hundreds. Karen Baldwin died as a result of the blast, as did astronaut Molly Cobb, as she was helping survivors get out of mission control. In honor of her heroic efforts, JSC was renamed the Molly Cobb Space Center in October of 1995. The bombing resembles the U.S.'s deadliest act of domestic terrorism, the Oklahoma City bombing in our timeline. In 1995, anti-government extremist Timothy McVeigh detonated a truck bomb in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, killing 168 people and injuring 680 others. McVeigh and his co-conspirators said that they were motivated by the government's handling of the Ruby Ridge incident in 1992 and the siege of the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas in 1993. Both bombers were convicted in 1997, with Nichols receiving a life sentence and McVeigh the death penalty. He was executed by lethal injection in 2001. The show's third season ends with the remaining crew stranded on Mars until a rescue effort can be launched from Earth. For his inaction during the mining incident, Danny Stevens is exiled to live in the North Korean capsule cut off from the rest of the mission. Before we move on to 1996, I have to tell you about the sponsor of this video, Surfshark VPN. In our timeline, 2023 was the year when I felt like Google search really went downhill and almost became unusable. I already use Surfshark at home for improved security and when I travel so that I can access geo-restricted content. But before they reached out about this Black Friday promotion, I had no idea I could upgrade to Surfshark 1 and get access to their lightweight search tool that only displays purely organic results with no ads or trackers. Plus, if you're normal and you hate spam and that makes you hate using your email address to sign up for websites just so you can see them, then Surfshark 1 also offers alternate ID, which creates a new email to hide your real email address so you can avoid spam and marketing emails. So if you're a Surfshark user or you want to sign up for a new account, use the code PetePeppers to get up to 6 additional months free as part of their Black Friday promotion. You can even try it risk-free because they have a 30-day money-back guarantee. Use my link on the screen or find it in the video description below to sign up for Surfshark today. Between seasons, 8 years pass, and in what has become the tradition, we're filled in on the major events that happened in the gap with Season 4's opening newsreel montage, and the collection of shorts that this time are named Leap into a New Millennium, which are included on the For All Mankind watch page on Apple TV+. The newsreel opens with President Ellen Wilson giving her speech at the Republican National Convention. We learn that she won re-election with George H.W. Bush as her running mate, in one of the most sensational come-from-behind victories by a presidential candidate since Harry Truman won re-election in 1948. Her becoming the first openly gay president is somewhat of a surprise, given the resistance that existed in her party leading up to the televised speech where she came out to the nation. It turns out the Republican Party establishment did turn its back on her and floated the idea of impeachment, but there was some popular support because, according to political consultants, she had the guts to stand up in front of the American people and tell the truth. She gained a lot of support thanks to her response during the JSC bombing, where she found the right balance of compassion for the victims and determination to catch the perpetrators. Regardless, her vice president, James Bragg, became a vocal critic and tried to primary her when she ran for re-election. Her Secretary of State, George H.W. Bush, endorsing her was a turning point, and announcing him as her running mate gave other moderates the political cover they needed to endorse her run. She also won over centrist Democrats who thought her opponent was too far to the left, forming what became known as the Wilson Coalition. In our timeline, Bill Clinton won re-election by a substantial margin in 1996, defeating Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole. And the first openly gay candidate to mount a major campaign was Pete Buttigieg in 2020. At some point in late 1996, the crews from the Race to Mars who were stranded there for 18 months returned home. The newspaper article makes it look like 9 astronauts and cosmonauts returned, but based on some of the dialogue in the first couple of episodes in Season 4, it's possible that Ed Baldwin has remained on Mars the whole time. The picture, which is taken at Happy Valley, shows the whole crew with the notable exception of Danny Stevens. His fate was unclear at the beginning of Season 4, but it's presumed that he died while in exile from the rest of the crew. To close out 1996, on his return home, Lee Jung-gil became a national hero in North Korea for being the first man to set foot on Mars. On January 20th, 1997, Ellen Wilson was sworn in for her second term. At her inauguration, Pam Horton held the Bible she was sworn in on. This is something that is usually carried out by the presidential spouse, but at this time it would have been illegal for Wilson and Horton to marry. Also that year, a suit was brought against Helios over their exclusive helium-3 mining contracts by Exxon, Shell, and Halliburton. By the end of the year, the Supreme Court ruled Helios's contracts were in violation of antitrust laws, which opened the moon up to different interests and reduced Helios's profits. This was on top of the company's struggles to regain its footing after the departure of co-founder Deb Ayesa and COO Karen Baldwin's death. But the company also landed an opportunity to turn things around by securing the exclusive contract to expand Happy Valley Base. The situation at the base underwent a drastic reorganization with the formation of the Mars 7 Alliance, which oversees operations with joint control shared by its member nations. The treaty, which was a personal triumph for Ellen Wilson, who made it a top priority for her second term, expanded the Mars colony, taking it from a research colony to an industrial mining station with hundreds of employees. The goal of the treaty is to end the competition and distrust that characterized the space race and usher in a new era of cooperation and partnership. The US, USSR, European Space Agency, the Coalition of Communist Countries for Spaceflight, North Korea, India, and Japan make up the M7. According to the maps displayed on screen, the ESA member nations include all of Western Europe, the UK, and Scandinavia, while the Coalition of Communist Countries for Spaceflight is made up of the Eastern Bloc communist countries in Europe, Mexico, Cuba, Venezuela, Egypt, and Turkey. There are some similarities to the International Space Station in our timeline, which operates as a joint venture. The ISS also awarded its first private contract in 2020 to Axiom Space, which will launch a new module for the space station in 2025. On the show, the two notable countries that abstained from joining the M7 were China and Canada. In the alternate timeline, China still regained control over Hong Kong from the United Kingdom in 1997, which for many symbolizes the end of the British Empire. There's also a news report that IBM's Deep Blue defeated chess grandmaster and world champion Garry Kasparov as it did in our timeline. In entertainment news, Jerry Maguire still exists in the alternate timeline, and there is a magazine article announcing the renewal of the sitcom Ellen for its 6th season. This carries some significance because in our timeline, the show was canceled after Ellen DeGeneres' character became the first openly gay lead after coming out in an episode in its 5th season. The show had been popular, and the ratings were at their peak when the episode aired, but declined shortly after amidst criticisms that it was too focused on gay issues and no longer family-friendly. Apparently, in a world with an openly gay president, attitudes have changed. Something that didn't change, Mike Tyson still bit off Evander Holyfield's ear in their first rematch after Holyfield defeated him for the WBA heavyweight title. In other sports news, Michael Jordan actually made it to the major leagues as a baseball player in the alternate timeline. In ours, Jordan briefly retired from basketball at the height of his career after his father was murdered. In pursuit of a new challenge, he played one lackluster season of minor league baseball with the Birmingham Barons. The next year, the Major League Baseball strike happened, which made him decide to quit rather than chance becoming a replacement player. So perhaps the strike didn't happen in For All Mankind's timeline, because in that he eventually became a major league caliber player. To close out 1997, with the Polaris Space Hotel disaster fading from recent memory, Hilton rekindled the space tourism industry by opening the first hotel on the moon. In our timeline, most of the excitement for space travel dissipated at the end of the space race in 1975. But there was an important milestone in 1997 when the Mars Pathfinder mission put the first robotic rover named Sojourner on another planet. It survived to conduct experiments for 83 Martian days, or sols, paving the way for the rover's Curiosity and Perseverance, which are still active on Mars right now. In 1998, a 5-month trial for the JSC bombing was held. Hal Goodman was found guilty of 3 counts of conspiracy and 195 counts of first-degree murder. He faces the death penalty. Sunny Hall was found guilty of 2 counts of conspiracy and 195 counts of first-degree murder. She also faces the death penalty, but her attorneys intend to argue for life in prison. Jimmy Stevens, the youngest son of Gordon and Tracy Stevens, cooperated and testified against the other defendants. As a part of his plea bargain, he was sentenced to 12 years and given a $200,000 fine. The leader, ex-astronaut Charles Burnitz, was killed in the bomb blast he set off. Around this same time, the Thomas Paine telescope was used to identify and map asteroids in an attempt to catalog the solar system's untapped resources. In September of 1998, Hillary Clinton filed for divorce from ex-governor and failed presidential candidate Bill Clinton, and there was a magazine profile of Kelly Baldwin's son, the Mars baby, when he turned 3. There was also a large-budget motion picture released about the Mars missions. Race to Mars featured Clint Eastwood as Ed Baldwin and Jada Pinkett as Danielle Poole. In 1999, 30 years after the historic Woodstock Festival, Woodstock 99 was held. Helios released a new spaceship called Unity that broke the Mars speed record that was previously held by Sojourner 3, thanks to a new engine developed by the company. Unity uses a nuclear fusion reactor to expel superheated plasma. This allows the ship to reach Mars in 31 days under optimal conditions. Helios declared the new engine a game changer because missions no longer have to wait for Mars launch windows to leave for the Red Planet. A second ship was announced to be going into production immediately. Each ship is 300 feet long and can carry 100 metric tons of cargo, with room for 50 personnel. They feature private cabins, zero-gravity showers, communal areas, and exercise facilities. This will aid in the rapid expansion of Happy Valley as the focus shifts to turning it into a large-scale mining operation. Of course, scientists haven't cracked fusion power in our timeline. NASA's unmanned Pathfinder mission, which delivered the rover Sojourner, used chemical propulsion engines and took 7 months to reach Mars when it went there in 1997. Nuclear fusion could be a potential source of abundant clean energy, but researchers hadn't been able to achieve a reaction that produced more energy than it took to create it until 2022 in our timeline. NASA also completed a successful sample run mission called OSIRIS-REx that visited the asteroid Bennu, which corroborated the vast mineral wealth of the asteroid belt. The space agencies believe that asteroids in close proximity to Mars may contain platinum, silver, and a variety of other precious metals. This has renewed interest in space exploration and that shift to mining I've mentioned, and it could all amount to a modern-day gold rush in outer space. OSIRIS-REx is based on a real-world NASA mission that returned samples from Bennu to Earth on September 24, 2023. That mission has also led to an increased interest in space mining in our timeline, but we're obviously far behind the show, having no presence on the Moon or Mars currently. In November of the alternate 1999, Harvey Weinstein is charged with sexual assault. Weinstein was convicted of rape in the 3rd degree and a criminal sexual act in the 1st degree in 2020 in our timeline. Then he was convicted again of rape, forced oral copulation, and 3rd degree sexual misconduct in 2022. More than 80 women accused Weinstein of sexual harassment, assault, or rape, with incidents dating from 1980 to 2015. In one of the more obscure news reports, it mentions that there was a successor to the supersonic jet, the Concorde, that's capable of achieving low Earth orbit. In our timeline, the Concorde was retired in 2003. Film director Stanley Kubrick died in 1999 at age 70, as he did in our timeline, but he completed the film AI Artificial Intelligence before he passed away, which is set to release and be his last film in the alternate timeline. This was a project that Kubrick worked on developing for over a decade before he approached Steven Spielberg in 1995 with a script and the idea of Spielberg directing it with Kubrick producing. Apparently, during the development, he had concerns about the special effects and all the crews involved, so he kept putting the project aside and decided to make Eyes Wide Shut instead. Just after completing that film, Kubrick died of a heart attack. So in the end, Spielberg made the film based on Kubrick's plans, writing the screenplay himself as a way to preserve his friend's ideals. The autobiography Recharged, written by the show's character Eli Hobson, was the best-selling book in 1999, which is very similar to the real-world auto industry CEO Lee Iacocca, whose autobiography was the best-selling nonfiction book of 1984 and 1985. Both books focus on how the executive saved Chrysler, with Hobson's subtitle mentioning that he was the son of an auto worker. One major difference here is that in the alternate timeline, he got the corporation back on track by leaning into the production of electric vehicles. From a newspaper clipping, we see that miners on the moon went on strike. The Federated Mine Workers of the Moon, that represents more than 1,100 workers at the Shackleton Crater mines, rejected a contract and stopped work. The strike lasted for at least 1 week, but there's no follow-up article about its resolution. In October of 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr. launched a run for Senate. In our timeline, Kennedy died in a plane crash on July 16th of that year. There are no further details in the article about where he's running, but it's of note that his uncle Ted Kennedy served as a Massachusetts senator until his death in 2009. In the alternate timeline, the Chappaquiddick incident never happened, and Kennedy became the president when he defeated Richard Nixon in 1972. The year 2000 opened with a computer bug that led to worldwide problems and knocked out the computers on the International Spaceport in the alternate timeline. This was dubbed Y2K and something that people worried about in our timeline because of the way computers store calendar data. There was concern that computers would be confused and not able to distinguish between 1900 and 2000, since they both would be recorded as the two-digit number 00. The panic turned out to be an overreaction, as nothing much happened when the new year started. While Helios expands its workforce on Mars, its former CEO, Dev Ayesa, started a new robotics company. The line of U.S. presidents has diverged quite a bit in the For All Mankind timeline. Gary Hart was the Democratic nominee who won the 1984 election with Al Gore as his vice president. In the alternate 2000 election, Gore defeated Ellen Wilson's vice president, George H.W. Bush, to become the 42nd president of the United States. In our timeline, Gore, who served as the vice president under Bill Clinton, faced off against Bush's son, George W. Bush. Because Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton were never president in the alternate timeline, the situation is quite different. But the show's description of the election night echoes some of the events of the 2000 election in our timeline, including the networks calling Florida early and then retracting their calls. 2000 was a controversial election because the state of Florida was so close, it triggered an automatic recount that got bogged down in legal battles. The Florida Supreme Court ordered a statewide recount of more than 61,000 ballots that the voting machines missed. Speculation at the time largely indicated that if this was carried out, the state and the presidency would be awarded to Gore. So the Bush campaign petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court, which stayed the recount with the justices split according to their political party. The stay meant the original tally was upheld and Bush became president. The show sidesteps most of the controversy by citing Gore's response to the Elian Gonzalez case as a reason for his support. Gonzalez was a 5-year-old that became a big news story after he was found floating on an inner tube off the coast of Florida after fleeing Cuba with his mother. She died in a storm with several other members of their party leaving the child alone at sea. His custody became an international incident when his father in Cuba petitioned to have him returned, while his relatives in Florida wanted him to remain in the U.S. according to his late mother's wishes. In our timeline, the Clinton administration's handling of the situation was said to cost Gore votes in Florida during the presidential election. The show flips this around so that it's the Republicans who lose votes because of the way Wilson and Bush handled things. In 2001, the now ex-president took advantage of her own landmark legislation to marry her longtime love, Pam Horton. The couple were married in a private ceremony in Houston, attended only by close family and friends. They also announced plans to move to a 1,600-acre ranch in Fredericksburg, Texas, which is about 80 miles from Austin. There's a brief news report in this section where the correspondent says, "Chaos reigns in Riyadh tonight after insurgents seized key government buildings in Saudi Arabia's capital. There are shots of combat in the streets and members of the Saudi royal family at the airport, but no further details about the story." A regime change there would seem impossible in our timeline, but I suppose this is further evidence of the change of power structures in a world with less reliance on fossil fuel production. The final short is dated 2001 and is titled Soviet Economic Boom. The newscaster describes an economic miracle that occurred due to Mikhail Gorbachev's implementation of glasnost and perestroika, which has attracted major corporate investment. In our timeline, perestroika lasted from 1985 to 1991 and is considered one of the primary causes of the collapse of the Eastern Bloc and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The distinction the show makes is the boom being boosted by advancements in the tech sector brought about by the ever-expanding Soviet space program. It also mentions the USSR exports iridium and lithium, which are both key ingredients in the batteries that power electric cars in the post-fossil fuel economy. The new liberal direction isn't universally accepted, though. The reforms have led to increasing income inequality and resentment towards the emerging oligarchs at the top. There are widespread claims that the nation has lost touch with its socialist roots, and the rise of political opponents that demand the country return to communist principles. The show introduces a character named Fyodor Korzhenko, a Politburo member leading an opposition that accuses the new middle and upper classes of cozying up with Western capitalists and betraying the country's working class principles. This mostly appears to be political grandstanding for upcoming parliamentary elections, but there's also a risk for Gorbachev if the country experiences an economic downturn. It's reported that supplies of iridium and lithium have been rapidly dwindling in an economy that has failed to diversify. The Soviet Union would be more vulnerable than the West in the event of a recession. And in our timeline, hardline members of the Communist Party who were opposed to Gorbachev's reform program attempted a coup d'etat in 1991. The coup ultimately failed, but it further destabilized the Soviet Union, and many speculate it played a crucial role in the collapse of the USSR. In 2002, Super Bowl 36 took place with John Lennon performing the halftime show. In our timeline, U2 performed at halftime in the game where the New England Patriots defeated the St. Louis Rams 20-17. Reality TV is still a thing in the alternate timeline, with real-world shows like The Osbournes and Survivor, but with the alternate timeline edition of a show called Moon Miners. At the end of 2002, relations between the US and the Soviet Union continued to improve. Gorbachev and Gore continued to have good relations on Earth and on Mars, which led the US president to declare that the Cold War was over, saying that a new era of peace and prosperity is before us, which is where the alternate timeline is left at the beginning of Season 4, and I think that is a great place to leave things. Let me know in the comments how you think things will change from here. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.